So please join me in welcoming Roger and Heather. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth. So this is going to be a little bit of a travelogue and a little bit of a history lesson. Most of the pictures are pictures that we've taken, but there's going to be some historical pictures in there too. And certainly, I think 2 years ago, this is not a subject that I thought I would be devoting any time to, let alone going to some of the places described here. But after my parents passed away, they had boxes of papers, old letters. At the bottom of one of them, I came across this newspaper clipping about 2 years ago. And I had remembered seeing this newspaper clipping when I was a child, and I had always assumed that it was a picture of my father, whose name is Robert Benham, and that it was a picture of him transiting Italy in 1944 on his way to Burma, because all I remember was this headline, "Benham describes arrival in Italy." So I just looked at it for real this time, and I realized it was from their hometown newspaper in Princeton, New Jersey, and that it was from 1918. And it's actually a picture of my grandfather, who I never knew, my father's father, and of him arriving in Italy. And this was a huge surprise to me, because if you know anything about World War I and the American forces that were sent to Europe, they went to France. That's where they fought. That's what all the songs are about. That's what all the pictures we've ever grown up on about. John Dos Passos' USA trilogy, which I read when I was a teenager. It's all about fighting in France. So I was really confused. What was my grandfather doing in Italy? So Heather and I started to do a little bit of research, and we came to find out that yes, there was one American unit that was sent to Italy in 1918, the 332nd Regiment of the American Expeditionary Force. And they were sent to Italy in response to one of the most devastating defeats of the entire war, of any war, at a place called Caporetto, when basically the Italian front fell apart. Ernest Hemingway wrote about that. He was a volunteer ambulance driver with the Italian forces in a farewell to arms. So we were doing more and more research, and since I'd never known my grandfather, in fact, my father didn't get along with him very well in a lot of ways, this was kind of a new thing to me. So I found out that actually he drove an ambulance, and that his unit was somehow, at the end of the war, was put into the Italian front, and that they ended up in Trieste. One thing led to another, and I think it was last summer, Heather said to me, well, you know, if we can find a cheap flight, why don't we go? And so that's what we did. First place we went to was Bolzano. So we're going to start talking about World War I by talking about this guy right here. This is in a museum in Bolzano, because one of the things about the Italian front in World War I, and you'll see as we have more pictures, is it was one of the most severe environments in which to fight a war that's ever happened. Probably the only comparison is the fighting that's been taking place between India and Pakistan on a place called the Siachen Glacier in the Himalayas, where they've constantly been fighting over the border of Kashmir ever since independence. And they fight at very high altitudes there. But here, most of the fighting took place along a line that followed this geologic formation we'll talk about later called the Carso, but also high in the Italian Alps, or the Tyrolean Alps. So what's happening now with climate change and the heating of the environment in Europe is all of these glaciers up on the Alps are melting. And so a lot of soldiers' bodies from 100 years ago that have been perfectly preserved have been coming out of the ice. And people will be hiking along, and they'll suddenly find an Italian or an Austrian soldier in World War I equipment that has just melted out of the glacier. The glacier has receded from them. In 1991, some people were hiking in what they thought was Austria, and they thought they came across one of these bodies. So they reported it, and investigation was made, and it was very quickly apparent to the people that checked it out that this is not a World War I uniform. This is not the way that World War I soldiers would have worn their hair, or that's not a World War I weapon. This is the body of somebody who came to be known as Otzi, and he died 5,000 years ago on what is now the Austrian Italian frontier. And Heather had done a lot of research on him, and at the beginning of the trip, wanted to come and see, this is a representation of him. In the museum, you can go to a little window and look into the refrigerator room where you see his mummified body. But it's interesting to start the trip with this because originally it was thought he was from Austria, so the body was taken to Innsbruck. It's the most significant late Paleolithic discovery in Europe in recent times. But then it found out when the glacier receded that actually the Italian border was further north than they thought. So Ötzi was repatriated to Italy, and that's just kind of symbolic. Go ahead.
Peacefully.
Yes. So that's symbolic of what's happened in the last 100 years between Italy and Austria. But now, of course, they're both members of the European Union, and they have an undefended border now. And so Ötzi is this big symbol in South Tyrol, which is the Italian region that we spent a lot of our time in. It was initially thought that he died while he was crossing the mountains on some trade, because he had a lot of trade items in his pack. But when they looked at him again a few years later, they found that they had overlooked a wound, and this in his right hand, and also one in his shoulder. It turns out that Ötzi was actually killed. He did not die. He was killed by a dagger. So we also started the whole trip with this. An arrow. Thank you.
An arrow lodged in his artery.
So he died on the same border that the World War I fighting was going to commence on. So you're looking at 5,000 years of fighting in this region where all of these different cultures come together. So there's a lot of castles, and these are not the kinds of castles that you'll see in other parts of Europe that might be in the middle of a farmland necessarily. A lot of these castles are in very deep mountain canyons. This one's called Mühlbach Fortress, built in the 1400s. It actually was built to block the entire valley. And this marked the border between the Republic of Venice and Germanic, I guess at the time it was probably a fiefdom or some kind of feudal state to the north. So every place that you cross a certain line in this region, you will find a castle up on the heights or guarding the river valley. So this has been a defended border for a long time. So after we drove from Bolzano, we drove south, the southeast direction. We rented a car. This wouldn't have been possible without renting a car. There's very good public transit in much of Europe, but we were in some very rural areas. And this is the Valparola Pass. We're going to have a lot more pictures from this area. This was one of the most contested areas during World War I. And that is Castle Andraz. It says they're built in 1027. When we found this, it was a day of lashing thunderstorms and mountain clouds and everything. It totally was the kind of castle that you imagine to be right out of Mary Shelley, Victor Frankenstein's castle, built on this rock. But this also marked the northern boundary of the influence of Venice. So everything on this side was historically Latin and Italianate and Venetian, and everything on that side going up over the mountains was Germanic. Language, food, agricultural crops, cultural influences. This is the split right here. And so that castle is 1,000 years old. It was used in World War I by the Italians as a military outpost, and it was actually shelled by the Austrians firing artillery from those mountains down onto the castle. So that castle was used for its actual military purposes for about 1,000 years. Very quickly, to look at a map to give you some sense of what was going on in 1915, 100 years ago, in Italy. Oh, by the way, I don't speak Italian. I picked up a little bit when we were over there. Heather speaks a bit of German, so that was a big help in a lot of the areas we were in. But if anyone here does speak Italian and I mispronounce a word, feel free to correct me. So this is what Italy looked like at unification. And unification was in the 1850s, culminating in 1859, I think, was the declaration of the Republic of Italy, or 1860s?
A lot of the fighting was between 59 and 70.
Okay, so the fighting of the War of Unification. Before that, Italy was these small states. So once a modern Italian state was established, it became a cultural project to try to incorporate as many Italian-speaking or Italian-influenced peoples under the control of Rome, the capital of Rome, and the Italian state. This didn't quite line up with the realities on the ground, though, because especially when you get to these areas further north, you would have people in one valley who were speaking Italian, people in the next valley over who were speaking German, the people in the next valley over who were speaking Latin, which is the indigenous language of the South Tyrol region, and then another valley over people speaking Italian, or sometimes they were all mixed together. But the Italian state had this project to try to assert their national identity. Of course, this is in the late 19th century when a lot of states in Eastern Europe are also doing the same. And a lot of people from around the world, like earlier when the Greek independence movement happened in the 1820s, people from all over the world identified that as being underdogs, as being a nationalistic, oppressed people. So a lot of people who later on might have identified themselves with the anti-colonial movement came and wanted to support this Italian expansion, what they called the risorgimento, the reclaiming for the Italian state what was culturally Italian, whether that was because it had once been ruled by Venice during the Middle Ages, or even in some cases going back and making claims about the Roman Empire and the Latin influence that was going on.
And they were also influenced by like, sort of like 19th century classical military strategy, and they were looking for natural borders or natural frontiers. So there were people that believed the border of Italy should be a continental divide, the highest rim of the Alps.
Which you can see from the right at the top of the map, the blue is where it says Trenton, and the yellow where it says Venete, that's Veneto and Trento. The rivers there all flow southward into the Adriatic, and they start much further north in what was Austria at the time. But the natural divide for that would have been north of the rivers. But everybody that lived in those regions, right here where my shadow is pointing, predominantly German-speaking, identified themselves as Austrians, actually identified themselves as Tyroleans, but they were very German. This is where you have the stereotype of what it looks like in the Alps, how people dress. This is actually how people dress in Tyrolean attire, lederhosen, leather shorts with suspenders and ornate kind of semi-abstract designs on houses and everything. It's very, very German. But Italy claimed, well, this is what our natural border is going up to those to the headwaters of the divide. So they called these territories that hadn't been incorporated in the Italian state yet the unredeemed territories. They needed to be redeemed in this process that was kind of conceived of as an anti-imperialist, against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Of course, what also was happening at this time was Italy itself was competing with the other Western countries in the race for colonies and to become an empire on its own. Starting in the 1890s, Italy had ambitions in East Africa. It had a colony in what's now Somalia, Italian Somaliland. They took the coast of Ethiopia, Eritrea as a colony. They attempted to invade Ethiopia. In 1896, they got their butts kicked massively by the Ethiopian army at a place called Adawa, a huge, huge defeat for European Western mechanized armies, much bigger than the Little Bighorn. Huge national humiliation for Italy. So Italy was always, the Italian state was always feeling like it was an underdog, but it was not just an underdog being oppressed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it also was an underdog in the race for colonies. So militarism was on the rise, and then that being as a way to assert Italian national identity. In 1911, Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire and took Libya from the Ottoman Empire, and that became an Italian colony. And there were these cultural movements as well that identified militarism and modern industry with liberty and other concepts. One of the most important was this artistic movement called Futurism. And the Futurists wrote stuff that sounds pretty insane to us today. It's very proto-fascist in many ways. They glorified speed, violence, warfare. They saw these as positive cultural things that were sweeping away the old superstitions and entrenched backwardness of Italy and of Europe. This is one of the most famous Italian futurist paintings by Gino Severini of an armored train in World War I. So you can see there's this abstract cubist thing going on, a lot of emphasis on motion. That convention we have in comic books that shows lines after when somebody's running, that comes from the futurists. That comes from these paintings here where they conveyed motion with movement like that. So, up until 1915, though, even though Italy had this beef with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were officially allies of Germany and of Austria-Hungary. They were one of the main allies, and in opposition to the other treaty that was between Britain, France, and Russia. So when World War I broke out in 1914, with on one side Germany and Austria-Hungary, and on the other side Russia, France, and Great Britain, everyone assumed that Italy would come into the war on the side of what were known as the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. That's what they had promised to do in their treaty. But they also had this argument, this ongoing conflict with Austria-Hungary over the borders. So there was a big drive on in the Italian government and Italian culture to get Italy to come into the war, yes, but to break its treaty and to come into the war on the side of the Allies, because this was an opportunity while they were fighting in Russia and France to sweep the Austrians from the contested territories in the north of the country. And 100 years ago, in May of 1915, that is what Italy did. Much to everyone's surprise, it suddenly did enter World War I on the complete opposite side of what it had agreed to do. And so this is Italian propaganda art from 1915, I difensori della civiltà, in defense of civilization, showing the Italian king, Vittorio Emanuele, and his generals against the four.
These are the other kings and monarchs.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Powers.
Okay, these are the Allied powers against the four. Thank you. Against the four Central Powers, because by this time Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire had also come into the war on the side of Germany. It's Kaiser Wilhelm and Emperor Franz Joseph, and the Ottoman Sultan and the King of Bulgaria. So Italy mobilized. At the time, there was no one standard school-taught Italian language that was commonly spoken by the majority of the population. The country was still, in many ways, an agricultural country. I mean, there were centers of industry in the north, in Milan and Turin and other places, but a large part of the population lived in the south, south of Naples, in Sicily, and even in the industrial areas. As soon as you left the city, when you moved into the countryside, the dialect that was spoken was often not intelligible to people that were nearby. So all of a sudden, they mobilized the entire country, just like they did in Britain and in Russia and France. But you had situations where the officers in a platoon did not even speak the language that was mutually intelligible to a lot of their soldiers. And this led to all kinds of very, very bad results in the opening days of the war. Also, just like we see with everything else in World War I, people were still carrying forward these ideas about uniforms and military tactics from the 1700s and the 1800s, but trying to fight it in a 20th century war with them. So in the beginning of the war, the Italian officers fought really hard for the right to maintain their sabers, because they really wanted to carry their sabers, because they were like, without a saber, I'm not an officer. And they might have had a point, because if you have a bunch of conscriptees, a bunch of draftees that are suddenly from some farm in southern Italy, and you're from Piedmont, and you're from an aristocratic family, and you're barking orders at them, they're not going to necessarily understand your orders. If you have a saber, you can use the flat of it to hit them on the back and to enforce discipline, or to kill them with it if they decide to run away. Of course, charging into a machine gun against the machine gun in a trench when you're tripping over your saber scabbard and everything, and also it makes you a big target for machine gunners. it was a disaster, disastrous at the beginning. But the big disaster that happened was this classical military theory that said, you have to seize the high ground. You must always seize the high ground. That's hard enough in a lot of places, but the high ground here, we're talking in some cases, is 10,000 feet high, glaciated mountains. And the Austrians held it because they had the divide. They had the higher ground. So the Italians decided to make it a priority to take all of the high ground. And this is basically the divide of that high ground, and that's where the trenches ended up being. So you had these murderous assaults in some cases where people are actually mountain climbing with machine guns and artillery firing down at them. To go around and to go through the river valleys and to bypass the mountaintops, that wasn't considered at first because it was thought you'd be too vulnerable for shelling from above, like Castle Andraz that I showed before. So this is, that red line is the line of the front as it settled in 1915, and then it became pretty static for 2 years until Caporetto. When Caporetto happened, there was a massive defeat for Italy, and basically the Austro-Hungarians, along with a lot of Germans fresh from the Russian front, they didn't have to fight there anymore because of the revolution, they basically just blew all the way through here, almost to the gates of Venice, and it was really thought that Italy might be knocked out of the war. That, incidentally, is when the Americans were sent to Italy, because the British and the French sent pretty significant divisions, and then they were leaning on the Americans, saying, you should really send somebody to help shore up the Italians. And John Pershing, who was the general at the time, was very resistant to that, but finally he said, okay, we'll send this one token regiment as a propaganda, pretty much as propaganda. And that's why in this book here, there's plenty of pictures of the American soldiers in Italy. We didn't really do that much, but they had a lot of photographers, apparently. No surprise there. So this is what it looks like up in that area. This is Europe's largest alpine meadow. It's called the DAmpezzo, and it's really beautiful country, and it's also extremely fertile country, even in these high valleys. You can see that's this is active pasture here. These are mounds of cow manure. A very high, well-watered plateau. The valleys are very fertile. A lot of wine is grown there. Even though there's high mountains, when you go down in the valleys, there's palm trees. It's a very stark contrast, but it's not the kind of land that the Austrians wanted to give up easily. There was also a fair amount of industry, even more now, and like I said, the people culturally were German, and they still are to this day. When we were traveling in this area, as soon as you got out of the cities, you spoke German to people, and they spoke it fluently. That's their first language. In the big towns now, Italian is more spoken in commerce, specifically in that one big town, Bolzano. But otherwise, it's pretty much still German, culturally German. This is the town of Cortina. So people might remember this from old movies in the 1960s, or if you're old enough to remember the Olympics, I think 1956. This is where the Winter Olympics were, Cortina DAmpezzo. It's this beautiful mountain town, right under the lee of the mountains, a lot of skiing. It became famous, for the jet set, people living there, vacationing there in the 50s and 60s because of the Olympics. But in 1915, it was a German city. So but it was in a valley that faced the Italians, and the Italians had no trouble taking it. So they occupied the city immediately. And they established prison camps, they arrested priests because they were thought to be, because they were representatives of the Austro-Hungarian state. So basically for 3 years during the war, this was an occupied city. This is a statue in the middle of Cortina of the Alpini, who are the Italian mountain troops, who were the patriotic symbol of Italy's effort in World War I. That's a historical photograph. You can start to see some of the conditions that they fought in. And this is the site of the most severe fighting that happened in the mountains in Italy that we went to about a week in. So this is this is the mountains above that castle that I showed you earlier, Castle Andras. This is at a height of about 7,000 feet right here where we're standing. So this was the Austrian Trench line at the top of the mountain. The barbed wire is still there 100 years later. You can see the wooden posts. That mountain in the background that has a little bit of snow on it is Tofana, or Col Tofan. In World War I, that was held by the Italians. So they were firing across this mountain valley at the Austrians up here on this mountain, which is called Lagozoi. So there was constant fire back and forth, machine gun fire and artillery fire. And the Italians actually planted a mine on that mountain and blew up part of the summit. We don't have a before picture of Tofana. I will show you a before picture of another mountain later on. But yeah, that area that Heather's circling right there, that was blown up and destroyed by Italians drilling into the solid rock underneath the Austrian positions. It made no appreciable difference in the line or the strategic sense or anything. This is some of the Austrian trenches. Very unlike the trenches that we're used to seeing. If you've seen pictures or movies about the Western Front, there was mud here, but most of it was rock. And they had to drill into solid rock using rock drills and then pile up rocks on the side. In some cases, the trenches actually had to be above the ground, piled up stone walls like around here. Or they just drilled directly into the mountainside. So this is an Austrian gallery. At the top of the mountain, you can see Tofana up there. And this actually goes back inside the mountain, and there are bunkers in there. And
this is about 9,000 feet right here.
this is 9,000.
Yeah.
No.
This is above where that first picture is.
It's often difficult for me to, I'm an American, I have a very difficult time converting in my head meters to feet. So sometimes that's why I get mixed up here. But about 3,700 meters, right?
I just remember that from the side.
Okay.
I don't remember it that well either.
So
Very high up.
Okay.
9,000 feet is pretty high, right? In the United States, you'd have to go out into the Rockies before you could get to 9,000 feet.
This snow Tofan here is like 10,200 or something?
Yeah, about almost 10,500. And when that snow appeared the day we were up there, by the way, the clouds came down, and then we went down into the mountain, and we came out, the clouds had lifted, and the snow was suddenly there. So below those positions, this is on this mountain, Lagozoi. So you have the Austrians, the trenches up above, and they're firing down into the valley. So what the Italians did was they started at the bottom of the mountain, and they drilled right up through it. So these are Italian tunnels that are running directly underneath the Austrian positions. This is an Italian machine gun position, so they would drill up through the rock, and then they blast a hole in the side of the mountain, and suddenly the Austrians would wake up in the morning, and there's a machine gun firing at them from the blank rock wall, and they're like, where's that coming from? Because during the night, the Italians had knocked a new hole in the mountain. Here you can see, can you put the cursor over it?
Yeah, but if you look, you can see at least 3 of these machine gun bolts here.
There's one there.
Down here, and
There's one right there. Yeah.
I don't know if that's one.
I think that is one.
But they were standing there. We could see a handful at least. Yeah.
But just a sheer drop of, I believe that's pretty much a sheer drop of 3,000 feet to the valley below there. This is looking out from one of the observation posts over the valley. You can see it's just beautiful, beautiful terrain. And one of the things that you read in veterans' memoirs, the Italian veterans' memoirs, is about being here. It was very strange because if you read any World War I veterans' memoirs, what really comes through is how brutal, pointless, grindingly boring, but terrifying at the same time it was. Trench warfare, basically, where 2 trenches faced each other for 3 or 4 years, and soldiers were constantly in this thing that was being blown up all the time. Dead horses, body parts, maggots, terrible, terrible, utterly horrible conditions. Here, though, soldiers were up in the mountains. It was cold, there was disease, they were constantly being shot at, but they were also in the middle of these just glorious glorious scenic vistas. And a lot of them were from places where they'd never seen anything like this before. Surprisingly, you'll be reading some of these Italian veterans' accounts, and they were young men too. They were 18, 19 years old. They'd never been away from home. And you couldn't mass, in most places in the mountains, the massive armies and the massive artillery that you could on the flats. So you might have one Austrian platoon above an Italian platoon, and they're literally right on top of each other for months on end. But they're dependent on ammunition that's being hauled up the mountain by porters. So sometimes there wouldn't be a lot of shooting, and you would just be up there with your friends and your comrades in arms, and you'd be in the middle of this pretty spectacular mountain scenery. We're going to talk about Italy's prime war poet in just a little bit, but that's one of the differences you see with Italian war poetry and the war poetry of Britain and Germany. And it's our contention that really had a lot to do with the rise of fascism, the way that even when they were writing about the horrors of war, there was also this sense of exaltedness, and the mountains also played in with the futurist idea of speed, and we're conquering the mountains in the same way that we're conquering time and distance with trains and airplanes and submarines, but we're also climbing this 10,000-foot mountain, lugging a machine gun up to establish the Italian state and redeem these unredeemed lands. This is looking down into that tunnel that we were in. We could have gone all the way to the bottom of the mountain. We took a tram to the top, by the way. We didn't climb 3,000 feet straight up. My father was a bit of a mountaineer. I'm not. But we could have taken this tunnel all the way to the bottom of the mountain. We went down quite a ways.
More or less. Blown up in some parts.
But it just went on and on and on. And thousands of men lived in that for 3 years, right underneath their enemy. This is at the top of that tunnel, again looking towards Tofan. It's not that far from the place where the Italians dug a mine on this side and blew up some of the Austrian Trench. This is at the top of Laguazoi. This is a trail called the Santiero. Well, it's yeah, so it's mixing Italian and German together. But the Kaiserjägers, or the Imperial Hunters, that was the name for the Austrian mountain troops. And this is the trail that they had across the top of that mountain, Laguazoi. So this would be what, 9,000 feet, you said? Yeah. This is a monument that's at the top there to the fallen on both sides. Because that's one of the other interesting things about this front is Austria is a Catholic country, a Roman Catholic country, Italy, a Roman Catholic country. So these soldiers that are on top of each other, killing each other, they shared exactly the same religion. They both worshipped in the Latin Mass. This is before Vatican II. There are pictures, I don't think we have any here, of Italian chaplains blessing the troops right on the front lines. There were Austrian chaplains perhaps like just above them doing exactly the same thing on Sundays. They could hear each other singing. They were singing the same songs in Latin. There's a picture kind of illustrating what it must have been like when you weren't getting shot at, or your foot wasn't in danger of being lost from frostbite, or you didn't have dysentery. There probably were some pretty nice days up there when everything was quiet. This is Laguazoi from the bottom, so you can get some sense of what it was like for the Italians to look up at this mountain. And you can see right at the top there's a structure. So that's what the tram goes up to. So you can see the cables of the tram. That's a refugio, or a mountain hut. In the summertime you can hike from hut to hut. It was closed by the time we were there. We were there in October, by the way. So that tram, a lot of these trams were actually constructed during World War I to bring troops and supplies up to the mountains. And of course now they're used in the summertime for hikers and in the wintertime for skiing. But so the Italians were being shelled from the positions of this refugio. So this is what we rode up to. So the tunnels we were in came down kind of this spine here. So the Italians started digging here at the bottom, and their tunnels went all the way up underneath the trenches. And the The wartime activities is pretty much what produced these talus slopes. Those were not there before the war. Those are the result of artillery bombardment.
And this is a mine crater right here. The talus slope.
So that's all artificial. You know, Heather and I have been to West Virginia and other places impacted by mountaintop removal coal mining. I know that some people have been here have been too. A lot of those techniques found out were actually pioneered here in the mountains in World War I, of permanently blowing up summits, and they use them now in Appalachia to get its tiny seams of coal. But this was actually a real war against the earth in many ways, because you can still see it 100 years later, and hundreds of years from now, it's going to be like that. They were moving as much rock as geologic processes do. Do you want to go back to that?
Oh, sorry.
So this is an Austrian trench a little bit further away, further to the southwest.
South.
Yeah, of where we were before. This is in a place called Passa Valparola. And you can see this trench is more of what we think of as a trench. It's actually set into the ground. There's been some restoration work here. It's a big open air museum, but pretty much it was built fairly solidly. They had months and years to build these things. And the Austrians didn't skimp on their trenches either. There are many reports of at the end of the war when the Italians finally got into the Austrian trenches, getting into the bunkers and being just really, really pissed off that when they realized how well the Austrians had been living. With beer and tobacco and nice stoves, and the Italians had been, freezing. Not the Italian officers, but the Italian privates. And that provoked quite a bit of resentment against the Italian state as it was being run in that way at that time. And the Italian state, I should mention, at this time was what was called at the time a republic. That is, there was a franchise. Certain people could vote. They had a king, the king of Piedmont. They made him the king of all Italy. It was on the side of the Western democracies like the United States and France and Britain, but it was not democratic by any way that we would recognize today. The franchise was very limited. People didn't have much power. And so this war that dragged on, and then eventually resulted in the defeat of Caporetto, caused a lot of people to say, well, republics and constitutional democracies, they're not working for us because look what they did in the war. And that also led directly to fascism. This is down in that valley, and this is another one of those mountains that was affected by mining. That's Col d'Istria. Thank you. Sasso is the Italian word for mountain.
Which mountain?
Hmm?
Which mountain? Which, like?
Oh, Stria.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sasso d'Istria means which mountain. Okay. But before the war, the summit extended over to here. You can see the crater. That's how much was blown out because the Austrians had fortified the top. The Italians spent several months digging underneath it, packing it with gelignite explosive, and blowing it up. That was the Italian, pretty much the Italians did the mining here because the Austrians had the high ground. It's interesting, it's kind of scary to think about. The amount of mining that was done on this front was nothing compared to the Western Front. On the Western Front, at a place called Messines in Belgium, the British dug, I think it was 12 or 15 mines?
19 mines, 17 of which actually went off.
And that explosion in Belgium was loud enough that it was heard in London. The tonnage at these mines was nothing compared to those mines. So just imagine if Italy had the industrial production that Britain and France had and was able to churn out more explosives. They would have leveled a lot more mountains. So even though this is really impressive and heartbreaking to see how much they altered the geology, it was nothing compared to what could have been done if they had more industrial development. So you can see the crater in there. If you want to go back again to Col d'Ilana, that's what Col d'Ilana looked like before the war, and that's what it looked like afterwards. It is a dormant volcano, but that was not volcanic action that caused that. That was gelignite explosive. There's a description, there's this great book, a social history of this front that Heather and I both read by Mark Thompson called The White War. And there's a pretty intense description of what it was like to be on top of that mountain when it was suddenly blown up. The Austrian officer who wrote it later said that when the summit blew up, he felt like he was standing on boiling milk. The limestone just like liquefied and threw him up and then threw him back down. This is a museum that's in an old fort there at Passo Valparaiso, and this is just an example of some of the diabolical ends to which things that people came up with in this trench warfare. So we think of World War I as being the first big mechanized war. The Civil War a little bit, but World War I is really when you had tanks for the first time, submarines for the first time, aircraft for the first time, machine guns for the first widespread use, chemical weapons for the first time. But you also had trenches which, when you broke into them, you suddenly were very close to the enemy. So they started to mass manufacture medieval, basically, weapons. So I don't know if it's kind of difficult to see in this light, but this is actually what we call a morning star. It's a mace with spiked balls and chains on a flail. It's a medieval weapon. And then there's other maces there. There's wire cutters. There's gas masks. These were weapons that were used by, the Germans called them Sturmtruppen, or stormtroopers. The Italians called them arditi, or there's another term that basically means legions of death. These were very indoctrinated, young, physically fit soldiers who would be sent into the trenches to engage in hand-to-hand combat. So if you could just imagine what it's like with mustard gas in the trench, you're wearing a gas mask, there's no visibility, there's smoke everywhere, and suddenly you're engaged in hand-to-hand combat with somebody swinging a morning star, trying to basically beat your brains out. The traumas that involved in this also directly led to the rise of fascism and to returning soldiers saying this form of government isn't working out for us anymore. I think the next passage, here's some of the armor the Arditi would wear. So you can see, we're basically back to the Middle Ages here. You're swinging a flail, you're wearing this kind of armor. You're fighting right around a castle that was built 1,000 years ago. It really came home to me being in this place. Wow, Europe's kind of a bit of a dark continent. We think of Europe as being the cradle of civilization, but for 1,000 years, people killing each other over this land. And then just 100 years ago, men in the trenches fighting hand to hand like this, dressed like they're basically back in the Dark Ages.
Is that an Italian helmet?
Yes. This is the kind of helmet the Italians would wear. It's a French design. It's got this reinforcement across the top against shrapnel. And then this is a helmet made specifically for hand-to-hand trench warfare. I mentioned earlier the very religious nature of both of these societies at the time. You know, it's interesting now, Italy and Austria, like much of Western Europe, one of the least religious societies that we have, much less religious than the United States. But in 1915, 1916, 1917, people were still very devout. So here's an example. This is an Austrian trench shrine. See, there's the Kaiser Jäger, the mountain soldier, dressed in full World War I kit. We don't think of World War I as being a religious war, but there certainly was a religious dimension to it. Chaplains, they were there saying that they were doing, the Austrians said that they were fighting for German civilization, and that was superior, and the Italians said they were fighting for Latin civilization against the barbaric Huns. But they both used the same religious iconography. So we drove down from the mountains. Can I get a time check?
So 3:45.
Thank you. We drove down from the mountains then on our way to Trieste, and we basically followed the line of the front. Before we got to this point on the Adriatic, we passed by Caporetto, which is in Slovenia, and we did try to go there because that's, in Italian, that's Caporetto. That's where the big battle on the front happened. But we were not allowed to drive our rental car across the border into Slovenia. It was they're both members of the EU, I don't know why. And it was too far to walk, and there was no reliable bus service. should I talk about Caporetto now, or just really quickly?
Sure.
All right, so I want to mention Caporetto because the reason that was such a success was because it was young German veterans coming back from Russia and France who had 3 years of trench warfare under their belts, who suddenly were thrown into the Austrian lines to fight the Italians. And they looked at this whole tactic of seizing the high ground and trying to fight your way up a mountain just so you could seize the summit and then be kicked off down again and fight your way back up. They looked at that and they were like, what the hell are you doing? Just go across the valley. So that's what happened to Caporetto. Basically, there was one German company that just bypassed all of the summits and just went laterally across the slopes. Instead of trying to go up and down, they just went this way. They circled around behind the Italians. They started firing on them from behind. The whole front started to collapse. There's an account of this one officer who led this company. When he surrounded the Italian soldiers, the Italians threw down their arms. They were so disgusted at this time, they actually picked him up. They picked up the German captain after they surrendered, put him on their shoulders, and ran cheering back into the Austrian lines, into the prison camps. That captain's name was Erwin Rommel, and that's how he became famous for doing that maneuver at Caporetto, which opened up the whole front. And after that, the Austrians and the Germans just poured into the North Italian plain, like I said, almost up to the gates of Venice. It was the most significant defeat probably of the entire war on any front, even more significant than what happened in 1918 when the Germans broke through and looked like they were going to win the war in France. And they basically did it. That's what happened in Germany. Just to digress for a second, in Germany, the veterans that came back, the right-wing veterans said, hey, we were winning in 1918. But actually, Germany was starving. They were completely out of industrial production. Their armies were really exhausted, so they made this big breakthrough. And so that became popular after the war to say, we won in 1918, so what happened? Well, we must have been stabbed in the back. Somebody back at home, the communists, the leftists, the Jews, the government, that's who stabbed us in the back, and that led directly to the rise of Nazism. So Italy has its own stabbed in the back myth that surrounded Caporetto, saying that it was the government policies that led to that defeat and almost to the loss of Venice, which Mussolini made a lot of headway with. And by the way, those men that were so demoralized that they ran cheering into the prison camps, when they came back from Italy, and when every other Italian prisoner of war came back from Italy, they were highly suspect under the fascist government. They were thought to have been traitors. They didn't fight hard enough. So a lot of them ended up facing political persecution. So this is down towards Trieste. We drove past Caporetto. This is the front lines that were on this formation called the Carso, or the Karst. You can see what this limestone is like. It's just very hostile. In summer, incredibly hot, windy. Most of this is carved by winds coming off the Adriatic in the winter. In the winter, this was covered with snow, very cold, so they had to dig trenches into this. There were shells falling all over the place, pieces of shrapnel breaking off from the rocks, getting buried, into people's skin with their clothes, and very, very harsh and hostile environment.
This was treacherous to walk on vacation on a trail that had been somewhat smoothed over. It was like you still had to watch your footing. So imagine like charging up this in the darkness in your leather boots and canvas uniform.
It's beautiful now. It's beautiful to hike there. This is actually a trail called the Rilke Trail, named after Rainier Maria Rilke, the poet who spent time along the coast here. So you can see why Italians would have wanted this section of the coast for themselves as well. But this is mainly a Slavic area now. Now we moved out of the German area into mainly the Slavic area. And this is the estate of that poet I mentioned earlier, Giuseppe Ungaretti. And this is a hill called Mont Saint-Michel. Some very pretty severe fighting happened here. It's beautiful now, but this oak tree, there's a little plaque, apparently was the only tree left standing in 1919 on this entire mountain. Up on the left is how it looks now, and then down the lower right is how it looked during the war. This was also the site of the first gas attack in Italy in 1916, I believe. That's a statue of Ungaretti. he's still thought of as being the prime Italian war poet. Like I mentioned earlier about Italian war poetry being kind of different than the British war poetry. He did write about the horrors of war, but I'll just read you a little passage from one of them. The Isonzo River is the front that this is along. This is what he wrote. He was a private, by the way, and this is what he wrote from the trenches. This is the Isonzo, and here I best recognize myself, a yielding fiber of the universe. My torments when I don't believe myself in harmony, but those hidden hands that soak and blend me regale me with rare happiness. Now that it's night and my life looks to me a corolla of darkness. That doesn't sound like Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon to me. After the war, Ungaretti became a fascist, like most people in Italy who were in public life. After World War II, he renounced it. He's still really admired across all political stripes for his poetry. But to me, anyway, it's a real contrast between the British experience, the French experience, the German experience, even the American experience. And this was interesting to us because that plant there on Ungaretti's estate, anybody know what that plant is? Can anybody recognize it from the flowers? Not. Yeah, it's Viburnum, which is a woody herb. It also happens to be what Otzi's arrows were made out of. So that was kind of interesting. Heather identified that. I wouldn't know what it was, and we realized that here where the first gas attack was, this war poet's now idyllic mountaintop. Here's the plant that Otzi made his arrows out of, and we know that because we found them in the bag. So it's very possible that the arrow that killed him, we don't have the shaft, was also made out of this plant 5,000 years ago. I should mention that this was a very interesting time to be doing this. It was just entirely coincidental that I found this newspaper clipping and got interested in this aspect. But this right now is 100 years. But of course, last year is the 100 years of the beginning of World War I. So everywhere we went along the front here, people were having exhibitions or commemorations. We stumbled upon an art gallery in Trieste where they were putting up an exhibition about war, mainly from an anti-war on terror, pro-immigrant stance. But it was very much on everyone's mind right now about World War I and thinking about war in general. And the way to see the way that people are commemorating it now in Italy, it's a very non-jingoistic, as you can probably imagine, non-patriotic way to think about it. Like this was a mistake. Kind of in contrast to what's been going on in Britain with the 100th year anniversary, where they've almost tried to rehabilitate World War I in a lot of ways and talk about it as like, oh, actually it was a kind of a good war. If the Germans had won, that would have been pretty bad. There might be something to that. The Germans were not very humane colonizers, if you saw what they did in Africa or in China, even before Nazism. But in Italy, definitely the whole enterprise is looked on at best with a jaundiced eye. And of course, that's because of what happened in between. This is Italy's largest war cemetery, so it's the equivalent of Arlington National Cemetery. Does that look like Arlington National Cemetery? Now, what does that look like? It looks a little bit like Albert Speer. That's because it was built by fascists. It's fascist architecture. You can see, it's difficult to see, but this is at a place called Reggio Puglia. It's difficult to see, but up here there's 3 crosses. And then each one of those crosses is what? Probably 30, 40 feet tall. This is huge. They carved it all out of the mountainside. You can see it from miles away. Each one of those steps is about this high. And it's got the interned bodies of, I believe it's 80,000 Italian soldiers. And at the base in that box is the body of the Duke of Aosta, who was one of the few Italian generals in World War I to pretty much maintain the loyalty of his men.
And because he displayed competence, he was one of the few to do that.
Yeah, he did his job. Yeah. Not necessarily well, but he did his job, unlike a lot of the other generals who didn't. An interesting thing here, so all of this time I was being conscious of like trying to look for little signs of, well, where were the Americans? By now we were so into the whole pathos and everything of what was going on that we'd come back and forth to this, but looking for the supposed monument to this tiny American unit caused us to go to some places we wouldn't have otherwise. We stopped here at Redipulia, and I went into the office and asked if they knew anything about the supposed monument in Trieste to American soldiers. And they didn't speak much English, but they referred us to these 3 soldiers who were standing outside, and one of them spoke English. And immediately he started telling us where to go for the World War II monuments. And I said, no, this is La Prima Guerra Mondiale. There were Americans here in World War I. And they were like, are you sure? No, you're thinking of World War II. And I'm like, no, I know. Not many. There were some. And so then we went across the highway to look at the cemetery itself. And this is where the office was. By the way, this is the cemetery, the non-fascist cemetery. This is where this looks a little bit more like what we're used to from a memorial park, right? This is where the families of the soldiers had started to bury them in the 1920s. And then the fascist government came along and said, this doesn't convey the right. We don't want you to be contemplative about the war. We don't want you to think about your loss and how your son went to heaven. We want you to be grand and conquering, and look, we got this land back. So this is on the opposite side of the highway. But so we crossed from this to look at the other monument. And one of these officers came after us about half an hour later, and I thought they'd just forgotten about us, and he did all this research on the internet. He basically found out what I had, all the details of this unit, the 332nd Regiment, but it was completely news to him. He said, yeah, there were Americans here, the 332nd Regiment. They were commanded by William Walker. After the war, they went and they occupied Dalmatia and what's now Croatia. So I asked him his name, and he's, I'm Colonel whoever, and said, I'm the commandant here. I just find it difficult to imagine going to Arlington National Cemetery and having the commandant come chase me down half an hour later to tell me he'd done some research. But it was something that they didn't know anything about yet. So, throughout this entire travelogue, we're kind of following along the trenches in the front line, but this was total war, right? That's what we kind of build this talk as. It was total war in that it even altered geology. They used every resource of the society. But it was also total war for everyone in Italy. So this is a photograph displayed in a museum we went to in Trieste of women working in a factory. I believe this factory was not in Trieste. I think it was in Turin. But Italian women at that time had never done this before, just like in this country, probably even less. So this brought a lot of women into the workforce. Of course, just like for men when they're in the military and they have to learn to communicate with each other, when one speaks a Piedmontese dialect and one speaks a Neapolitan dialect, that's a lot of the reason why people have started to learn a standardized Italian. The same thing was happening on the home front with women who were coming together, migrating from their rural towns to the cities to take these jobs. And of course, along with that came a lot of the things that led to greater emancipation for women, greater access to health care, contraception. Just think about what it was like to be working in a factory and all your men are away at war, and you just come from a rural agricultural village. So this was a huge disruption to traditional Italian life. And all of these disruptions were coming at the same time that the government was being thoroughly discredited for having 3 years of trench warfare that ended up with this huge defeat at Caporetto. So men came back, and suddenly their women weren't as docile or traditional, and that also fed into men going off and joining squads to try to restore traditional values, and that contributed to the rise of fascism. This is a picture of Trieste from the top of its castle hill. So it's distinguished by these red tile roofs. That's what James Joyce referred to it as, my precious Trieste of red tiled roofs. This is where Joyce wrote A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where he started Ulysses. He lived there until the war broke out. He taught English, but he had to leave when the war broke out because he was an enemy alien. Because Trieste was, at this time, the prime seaport for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Joyce, being Irish at the time, was a British national. So we stayed at this bed and breakfast in Trieste, and these were our hosts, Silvano and his daughter Judith. And I just wanted to throw this picture in here because they were so nice when we kept on asking if there was any evidence of the Americans in World War I in Trieste, they knew nothing of it either. So they sent us to all these out-of-the-way places in the city trying to find this mythical statue that had details about the unit. Invariably, we ended up something, it was a monument to World War II. Or to what happened afterwards, because after World War II, Trieste actually was a United States protectorate. I didn't know any of this. For 10 years, or no, 9 years, from 1945 to 1954. Trieste was the only city in Western Europe in World War II that was not liberated by the Western allies of the Soviet Union. Trieste was liberated by the partisans from Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans. So it was communist partisans coming over the border after they liberated their own country, and that's also the only country in World War II to liberate itself without any outside help. The only occupied country was Yugoslavia. Then they crossed the border and they liberated Trieste on May Day in 1945. And then the Americans came in to be a peacekeeping force because Italy was like, we want Trieste back. Yugoslavia was like, no, you were allies with the Germans in World War II. We should have Trieste. But of course, Italy wasn't just allies with Germans. If you know what happened with Italy in World War II, I don't want to get into it. In 1943, they switched sides. This is where Italy gets a certain reputation about switching sides. In World War I, they were supposed to be in the war on the side of the Central Powers. No, they decided to come in on the other side. And in World War II, they kicked out Mussolini right before they got invaded, and they switched sides. So Italy was actually an ally in World War II, but it was also an Axis power. So it was an adjudication, an international adjudication for about 10 years where Trieste would go, and it was declared an international zone, and it was administered by an American general who basically ruled it as the same way that we ruled those sections of Iraq for a few years under the Provisional Authority, which I knew nothing about. But anyway, that's why Silvano there is an American citizen, because he was born during the American occupation. So if you were born in Trieste between 1945 and 1954, you are an American, a natural-born American citizen. I cannot wait till somebody from Trieste wants to run for the United States presidency. Because they would have as much right to it as John McCain, as far as I can tell, being born in Panama. So they directed us to this one museum, the Museo di Guerra y Paz, Museum of War for Peace, which was a fascinating...
Museo della Guerra e Paz.
Thank you. That's how we would actually say it. And this museum was started by a guy who was who fought partisans in World War II. He was a fascist soldier, and after the Americans occupied Trieste, he recanted, and he decided to try to gather up all this war material, half-tracks, artillery pieces, tanks, and put them on display in this big parking lot as a monument for peace. It's a very interesting museum filled with all of these wartime artifacts, but constantly pushing, like, this is how bad war is. Look at all the energy we put into building this huge mountain cannon in 1918. What if we took that energy and put it into peace? I've never quite been to a museum that had that perspective, but that ambivalence seemed very much like symbolic to me of Trieste, and perhaps there was a certain aspect of the Italian experience of both wars as well. These are Austrian sailors in Trieste in 1918. So this is while the war is still raging. They just had this big victory at Caporetto. Russia's been knocked out of the war. The Germans look like they're actually going to win in the summer of 1918. These guys are just hanging out in Trieste with a sign here, Sempre allegri in my passion. Anybody speak Italian? Okay, I don't want to mangle translating that, but this is the interesting thing. Lavoratore, that newspaper is. The worker. That's the socialist newspaper. So the newspaper they're reading is the Italian socialist newspaper. They're Austrian sailors. The Italian socialist newspaper was against the war at all throughout the war. So that's actually a treasonous act, what he's doing there. He's holding a newspaper from the enemy that's against war, and that's against imperialism, and that's against empires at all, that actually wants to set up a socialist republic. And he's having his photograph taken with it. And he doesn't have any problem with that. So while the Italian military was falling apart at the end of the war, so was the Austro-Hungarian military. These years of war, of total war, had just exhausted everyone, to the point where you have these sailors at home in their base holding up an anti-war newspaper. And it was a big deal to have your photograph taken if you were working class back then. It's not like now. You know, you knew you were having your photograph taken. He's got no objection to that. At this time, units of the Austro-Hungarian military were basically in open revolt. They were starting to do things like elect their officers. They were starting to take votes on political matters. These units in the Austro-Hungarian side, I've talked mostly about the Italian side, but the Austro-Hungarian side, Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multi-ethnic empire. It was dominated by Germans, but there were Slavs, there were Bulgarians, there were Greeks, there were many different kinds of Slavs who worshipped many different kinds of religions, Eastern Orthodox, Muslims. There were Bosnian units that wore fezzes, who the Italians derided as being Muslim fanatics who went into battle. Towards the end of the war, in the last couple months of the war, right about when the Americans and the other propaganda, British and French, arrived in Italy, they started to have votes. There's an account in this book of a vote that was taken in Austro-Hungarian units saying, okay, who wants to be for the emperor? All right, who wants to be for an independent Slovenia? Ooh, all the Slovenes raised their hand. All right, and who wants to go home to wherever and have an independent Croatia? Oh, and all the Croats put their hands up. And so these units started to break down along ethnic lines and eventually go back to their home areas to have established independent republics. In 1918, Hungary actually, the center of the empire actually split right in half. Austria-Hungary became Austria and Hungary, and in Hungary they had a communist revolution and it became a communist nation, just like the Soviet Union. Which prompted it being invaded by everyone around it to knock it out, to change that right away. Yeah,
so loosely, if this is Italian, it's something about their beliefs or their passion, but not passion as we define it, but their desire for who they are, being able to be brought forward forever.
Okay, great. And then Buon Natale, do you know? There's something about birth?
Buon Natale, Merry Christmas.
Yeah.
Merry Christmas. So this is Christmas 1918. This is their Christmas party.
Because Sempre is always, and Allegro is to move forward quickly, and then
Okay, so that's great. So that shows that this is after the war has ended. So this is Christmas 1918. This is when that socialist revolution is happening in Hungary, and the rest of the empire is splitting into this independent country.
And otherwise they look like a Freddie Mercury tribute.
Yes. That probably explains why he doesn't have hesitation in having his picture taken there, because there's no longer an Austro-Hungarian government at this point by Christmas of 1918. It fell apart a month before. And then this is that same museum. This was towards the end of the trip. Never did find this statue, this supposed statue to the 332nd Regiment. But here's this ambulance in the museum. So here, as I can figure, this is what the ambulance that my grandfather would have driven when he finally got to Trieste in 1918. That bed and breakfast really excited us for a second because the street it was on was called Hôpital Militaire, or the military hospital street, and that's what the Americans mainly did at the end of the war. They set up a big military hospital in Trieste when it was seized from the Austrians, and that's where my grandfather's ambulance would have been based out of. So I got really excited thinking, this is the street maybe that the military hospital was on, but nobody could give me any answers. They said, well, there was some military hospital here at some point.
That's it.
Did your grandfather drive ambulance for the Army or for one of the volunteer ambulance services?
He was in the U.S. Army, so he was in the American Expeditionary Force. So this unit, the 332nd, went, he wasn't in that unit because that's an infantry unit, but it also went with a military hospital and with one U.S. military ambulance company, which is what would have been his unit as near as I can tell.
So you talked about like the sort of the strange tenor of the writings of Italian war veterans. I mean, I know there were so few Americans in there, but did you see any difference between like the writing? Did you see any writings from non-Italians that also were in Italy during the war or at that time, and did you notice a difference?
Well, I mentioned there's Hemingway's book, A Farewell to Arms, which is a pretty disillusioned book for anybody who's read it. But that's the only writing that I'm familiar with from an American who's on this project.
I missed the beginning somehow. How did you hear there was a statue or a monument?
I found that in some corner of the internet that when I went to go looking for it again had vanished. So I know I read it somewhere, but I've never been able to track it down again.
Is this the only piece of writing that you have from your grandfather? Were there any letters, any other photos of him on the site?
No, this is it. I would have no idea that he was in Italy if I hadn't found this. I have all my father's letters from World War II. Coincidentally, he also drove an ambulance not because he was a pacifist, but because he was for F or other things. But I have a big stack of letters from him. But this is the only evidence I have that my grandfather was in Italy. I do have his discharge papers somewhere, and there's a listing of his decorations online. The Army lists. You can go online and find all the decorations that have ever been issued. I'm sure they're always entering more. So there is a little listing. He got some good conduct medal or something, but it doesn't say where it happened. It just said it was in 1980.
Who did your father drive for?
The American Field Service, which was a volunteer, non-military attached to the military.
Anybody else have questions for Roger?
Or Heather.
Roger and Heather, thank you very much. Wow, that was really great. Thank you so much for that presentation. I can't believe they blew tunnels inside the mountain to make their windows for the guns. That just amazes me. I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon and spending some time here at the museum. And there's more lemonade and cookies. Thank you all. And Roger and Heather, thank you so much for your time. That was great.
Thank you.